Ramzan Kadyrov is one of the most brutal dictators in the Caucasus, but is he also apparently a UFC title holder? The UFC's biggest star is getting real cozy with Chechnya's brutal dictator. And does the trail of evidence point to the White House? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this, for those of you that don't know, is Khamzat Chimaev. He is a UFC superstar and just became UFC champion in a one-sided beatdown of South African and bizarrely named Dricus du Plessis. And the real story, though, is that this is also a Russian passport holder, but specifically a Chechen fighter. And Chimaev has had what we'll generously describe as a number of problems, due to his associations with Kadyrov. But, is this just, maybe this is just some made up stuff. Maybe this is just bad mouthing. But no, observe, this is from Chechen state media. As you can see, Chimaev returning the triumphant hero to Chechnya, and he is greeted by Kadyrov himself. This is the Chechen dictator. And you can see he grants Kadyrov the belt, Kadyrov happily taking the belt, and of course, posing for pictures with the champion. And I think if there's one thing, you should make a couple notes here, but most notably is that clearly, on some level, the UFC not particularly bothered by their superstar champion handing a literal UFC branded belt to Kadyrov. Now, but why am I so worked up about this? There's a gazillion dictators all over the world. And certainly Kadyrov is famous for putting these elite fighters on his payroll. In fact, in a lot of cases, the Chechen government subsidizes their training facilities. And of course, he's gifted a Mercedes Maybach worth over $200,000 to Chimaev. Now, why am I so worked up about Kadyrov? Because he's a kind of horrible person, right? Now, before the war in Ukraine even started, he was subject to an array of sanctions by basically every Western country. You can see his Wikipedia page. I encourage you to take a look at just to see how brutal he is. Right, disappearing and torturing his political opponents, but also disappearing basically anyone suspected of being gay, including, in fact, jailing them and in some cases releasing them early if their family promises to kill them. Of course, he's also threatened journalists, which is just almost a given in Russia. But if you don't want to read this multi paragraph, I mean, several hundred words of just a litany of torture and human rights violations and crimes, you can at least go down to the bottom here where, for example, in 2022, the wife of a judge of the Supreme Court of Chechnya was abducted, absconded to Chechnya for interrogation, where she was charged with assaulting a police officer. And of course, Kadyrov said simply that the former judge's family members would all be put in prison or underground. And he also asked the Supreme Court of Russia to formally kick out the judge and erase his name from the history of the judicial body. Notable, the judge is actually the mother of a Chechen human rights activist and former lawyer for the Committee for the Prevention of Torture. And of course, in May of last year, a media outlet showed a video depicting a man burning a car bearing the symbols that are kind of associated with Kadyrov's son, Adam. And Chechen authorities then went on to arrest 90 people from the city where it took place. And one man, Abdullah Magomedov, was tortured to death. And another person was also killed associated because of this viral video. And of course, authorities have also targeted the relatives of those arrested. But that's not all, because remember, the Chechens, right, Kadyrov has personal control over the Chechen militia, right? Sometimes Russia calls them law enforcement agencies. Sometimes Russia calls them like units of the Russian forces. Sometimes they're referred to as like Ministry of Interior troops. And sometimes they're just considered like personal bodyguards of Kadyrov. But no matter what their formal title is, they answer directly to Kadyrov and Kadyrov alone. And they are used as his enforcement arm, not just to commit human rights violations, but to remain in power. And it's one of the reasons that early in the war, Chechen units were actually kept in the rear areas, because the thinking went that Kadyrov, if his loyal Chechen soldiers were to get killed off in Ukraine, then he would have a hard time staying in power. I can't imagine how someone, such a nice guy, could make enemies. But here's just a couple of examples of sort of the behavior of his units in Ukraine. According to Ukrainian media, Chechen troops were used as barrier troops in executing Russian deserters or Russians who would retreat, who would be ordered to assault and either would refuse or would retreat back to their starting lines. They would be shot by Chechens who didn't really see a problem because, well, you know, they're Chechens. And if you look or act different than their ethnicity, you're just less of a person. Ukrainian media also reported that Chechen troops executed conscripted soldiers of the Luhansk People's Republic who refused to fight. This is the Russian, this is occupied Ukraine. There were also unconfirmed reports of Chechen troops were executing Russian troops who were too injured in field hospitals, right? And Ukrainian intelligence also alleged that a unit of Buryat soldiers and Chechen troops actually literally got into a firefight in Kherson over who got to loot what. And Kadyrov now has reported that Chechen fighters in Ukraine had sustained losses of 2 killed and 6 wounded, which is unbelievably not true. Basically, that's the best evidence that the Chechens are nowhere near the fighting, because literally 2 killed, 6 wounded is like, that's like one traffic accident. No chance these guys are in any danger if that's the kind of casualties. But reportedly, this policy changed sometime in 2023 or 2024 when the Russian military really just ran out of human beings to throw into the meat grinder. Chechen troops famously participating in the siege of Mariupol and sarcastically referred to as a TikTok warrior. The TikTok warriors or TikTok battalions. In fact, Kadyrov himself purportedly went to the front lines of Ukraine, but when he dropped a video, he appeared to pray at a gas station whose brand only exists in Russia. This would be the equivalent of me saying, hey, look, I went to go fight in Ukraine, and then you see me high-fiving people outside a 7-Eleven. You'd go, you know, I don't think they have 7-Elevens in Ukraine. But maybe they do, but, you know, it would be obvious, right? There'd be a bunch of like English language signs. Of course, the Chechens, doesn't mean just because you're in a rear area doesn't mean you can't commit war crimes. Reportedly, during the Russian retreat from Kiev, Chechen fighters from Kadyrov's units shot literally every civilian they met. A resident said Russians would check cell phones for anti-Russian activity and then shoot civilians. Ukrainian security forces identified that members of Kadyrov's Akhmat Special Forces unit abducted and committed sexual assault against 2 girls during the Russian occupation of Mykolaiv. And so you can see pretty clearly that there is robust evidence that Kadyrov maintains this tight inner circle. He uses MMA fighters like Chimaev to sport wash his image, to give him the appearance of being a cool, tough guy. And if you want to see how committed he is to his cool, tough guy image, you can Google his sons, who he has routinely reportedly sent to the front lines of Ukraine, and then decorated them literally 16 to 20 times each for their frontline military service. And well, either he's a total liar, which I think is most likely, or what's more like, or if he did send his sons to the front line, he's really creating units of child soldiers, which is also kind of twisted. So I think it's uncontroversial to say that Kadyrov's and his inner circle have been subject to sanction by basically every single Western country. And the sanctions were bad years ago when he was just disappearing gay people and political opposition. But now that he's actively leading units of war criminals, you can imagine the sanctions around him and his inner circle are pretty tight. And again, given that Kadyrov greeted Chimaev off the plane, granted him a $200,000 Maybach, and took this belt right off his hands, you can imagine that Chimaev has also been subject to these sanctions. Now, here's what I love, is that the UFC has spun this, the fact that they are allowing a sanctioned individual who is buddy with a war criminal in Khamzat Chimaev. The UFC kept saying, well, Chimaev just has visa issues that prevent him from entering the U.S. for fights. In fact, Chimaev has not been able to enter the U.S. since September 2022 due to visa problems. No, it's because he is a sanctioned individual due to his ties to a brutal dictator, right? Being literal like besties with a brutal, brutal dictator. They say this was a major hurdle in obtaining a visa. No shit. And so here's what I think is pretty funny. Obviously, Chimaev just fought in the United States, but when did he suddenly get permission to get a visa? Well, this was in February 2025. Crazy that he was able to get a visa just a few weeks after President Trump took office. And remember, Dana White is a huge supporter, a huge fan of Donald Trump. So if you are friends with the president, you can literally say, listen, you don't have to worry so much about these all of these Russian war criminals and all of their inner circle. I just need you to give this guy a visa. So Chimaev performatively gets UAE citizenship in January of 2025. And then the State Department goes, oh, he's a UAE citizen. Obviously, the sanctions are lifted. He's free. Guys, he wasn't sanctioned. Like, all people from Chechnya are not sanctioned, okay? He is sanctioned not because he is Chechen or because he has a Russian passport. He can't get a visa because he is associated with a dictator. Not associated with, I'm being generous. He is on the payroll of a brutal dictator. And the fact that the UFC president is best friends or a major supporter of the current president seems to have simply allowed him to part the seas and gotten his elite fighter a visa and just circumvented U.S. sanctions. And in fact, Chimaev himself says he credited the White House for helping him secure a visa. So he literally says, guys, Dana White or someone connected to the White House personally intervened to get me this visa, to let me circumvent sanctions. And so here's what you got to ask yourselves. Is this a White House? Remember, this is also a White House who you'd think would be very sensitive to issues around Russia because, well, remember, they were, according to the president, he was falsely accused of partnering with Russia to promote himself to the presidency in 2016. So just sort of chew on that for a while. Think to yourself, for someone who's reportedly, definitely committed to showing he is not in the pockets of the Russians, he has gone out of his way to allow his friends to circumvent sanctions and let someone on the inner circle, on the payroll of a brutal dictator, come to the U.S. and fight MMA. Love it, dude. Anyway, just something to think about. See ya. Cheers.